So I have mentioned many times that the setting that my desktop image changer is set to change every day, random, from a group of selected images. And I've also explained that since I don't really, participate in an understanding or belief in the concept of chance in the way that some people do, that I consider these images the selection of some form of intelligent entity. And this is the image that I received, this morning. So there's really a lot to say about this image, and it kind of inspired me in a way to think about Societas and communities and the way that human consciousness protects itself from its own self-understanding. One could argue that if one believes in something, not necessarily one-to-one correspondence with, but something like what Freud articulates as the shadow, that the encounter with one's own shadow is a necessary part of development and understanding the negative aspects of aggression and disgust and animus and violence and all of those aspects of self that we don't want to deal with, and because we don't want to deal with them, we project them on others, and we bless you, and we idealize and reify, more more positive aspects of ourselves, and reject and ignore and hide and recycle and project, those negative aspects. So I was thinking about this image of the broken glass in that way, and I wanted to explore that idea of the shadow in relationship to this idea from Victor Turner called Societas. It's, the closure of a community. You're not one of us. And, religions, do this primarily. Political parties do this, and, other group formations do this. You could argue that it's a universal function of group formations, and probably why I'm not particularly fond of any group formations. So I wanted to call this list poem Affirmations of Societas. We like breaking glass. There's no question about that. Just not your breaking glass. We like expressionism. There's no question about that. Just not your expressionism. We're an open society. There's no question about that. We're just not open to you. We like insects. There's no question about that. We just don't happen to like spiders. We like sharp edges. There's no question about that. We just don't like these sharp edges. We like open spaces. There's no question about that. We just don't particularly care for these open spaces. We like edges. There's no question about that. But we don't care for these particular edges. We like camera movement. There's no question about that. But just not these kinds of camera movement. We like background noise. There's no question about that, but certainly not that kind of background noise. We like shapes. There's no question about that, just not these kinds of shapes. We like individuals with disabilities. There's no question about that, just not your kind of disabilities. We like people of all races. There's no question about that, just not your race. We like all people with all political persuasions. There's no question about that, just not your political persuasion. We like animals. There's no question about that, but this animal is dangerous. We like cultures. There's no question about that. We like all cultures, but this culture is dangerous to our culture. We have no qualms with individuals who stray from the norms. That's not our problem. But this kind of straying from the norm is dangerous to the sense of the norm that we hold. We have no qualms in those who stray from the norms. But this type of straying from the norm threatens the center of the norm. I like all the images in my desktop image file folder, just not this image in my desktop file folder. I like all the cracks in the image of this particular window, just not this particular crack. I like dirty windows, just not this particular dirty window. I like broken branches, just not this particular broken branch. I like the way things look behind bars, just not these particular bars. I like metaphors, just not this particular metaphor. I like metonymies, just not this particular metonymy. I like poetic constructs, just not this particular poetic construct. I like all kinds of light, just not the light that comes through a broken window. I like visual artifacts, just not digital visual artifacts. I like rainbows, just not digital visual artifact rainbows. I like sound poetry, that includes silence. But I don't particularly care for silences. In poetry that has ordinary semiotic content. I like sound and image disjunctions in art, but I don't like sound and image disjunctions in bad art. I like personal expression from people expressing themselves. But I don't like personal expression coming from bad people expressing themselves. I'm against censorship. Of course, sometimes we have to censor people if they express opinions that we don't like. I consider myself a radical modernist. And what I really like about poetry is a well-crafted, well-made work of art made by a really talented individual. So having made the poem Affirmations of Societas, I now realize that it belongs to a series of pieces, and this series belongs to this image, and this series belongs to this day. And it's a series that, you know, it is a part of the ongoing work that I've done. Called Displacements. And the second piece that belongs to that series will be a discussion of Denny. And if you don't know Denny, you know, you must be pretty new to my work, because you know, Denny is a person I met in the 1980s, a young man I met in the 1980s who's become a central and defining figure. Of my work, you know, over the course of decades. And you know, in ways that, you know, recently I've taken up the figure of Aion, the AI that Harold Cohen created, and, you know, in a sense, I've adopted Aion and am, you know, teaching him art making in a certain curious way that also, you know, engages a lot of political issues and technological, you know, theory and philosophical theory and other issues, you know, that surround, you know, what it is to be human. And Aion is a kind of, you know, guided Pinocchio figure, or, you know, guided Mary Shelleyan, you know, creation. And Denny, so I find it hard to imagine that there's I find it hard to imagine that there's much of an audience listening to this piece who don't know my relationship with this, you know, young man named Denny, but I'll, you know, describe it briefly, you know, for those who might not. So I was providing childcare for the son of one of my wife's coworkers in the early 1980s, and she, you know, worked for the post office at that time, and something happened to, you know, the boy's, you know, regular care worker, and you know, he needed an emergency sitter, you know, to watch, you know, him throughout the day. And so, you know, I volunteered, and I thought, well, we'll spend the day in Balboa Park, and that'll be fun for him, and it, you know, certainly was, and we did, you know, we engaged all these activities, and he was kind of a wild child, which was, you know, fun, because I got to see his enthusiasm, and, you know, some people would say, you know, not particularly well behaved. That didn't really bother me. It was, you know, for me, just an expression of, you know, his energy, and the fact that, you know, he hadn't had a lot of structured activities, you know, so I was really excited, you know, to help be able to provide him with a day filled with structured activities that we could move from in a kind of coherent way that, you know, built, you know, different kinds of learning skills and engaged his mind in different ways. And Balboa Park was a great place to do that. So this is in San Diego, California, for those of you not familiar with Balboa Park and the San Diego area. And, you know, during the course of, you know, engaging these activities, there's a tree there, and it's a very, like, beautiful, lush tree, probably South American, with these roots that stick powerfully out of the ground, and there are all these tangles and vines, and the children, you know, love climbing in it and exploring the recesses and bridges that its roots create, and it's a place of play and social gathering, very much like a playground, but it's provided by this living tree, this living entity that, you know, has been in this place, you know, for decades, perhaps, you know, since the founding of, you know, Balboa Park, and I really don't know that history. Could easily look it up. it's hard not to think of it as a symbol of life, and it's hard not to think of it as a symbol of giving, and one thinks of the giving tree. You know, one thinks of the tree of life. And you know, and so we were there, and you know, watching, you know, the children play, and the child that I was caring for was having a great time, and but off to the side, you know, there was a child in a wheelchair, and you know, I could sense, you know, that he, well, you could see that, you know, he wasn't engaged in the same activities as the other children, and that, you know, no one was paying attention to him. And you could see that, you know, he was trying to listen to the activities. And you could see that he was, you know, neglected. And there were children there that, you know, obviously belonged to groups, like groups of children from schools or other programs, and then there were, you know, perhaps individuals who were there, you know, from families, and so there were many adults present, but no one was attending to this child that. This is not his name, but I refer to as Denny, even though Denny is not his name. You know, so it's not really what I'm going to talk about today, you know, what we talked about, but I approached him and I talked to him. And, you know, there were fires. There were fires in the mountains at that time, and he wanted to know about these fires, and he was concerned about these fires. And we talked about the fires and whether they were being contained, and I spent, you know, about an hour with Denny, and then, you know, he became part of the first set of. A representation of Denny in our discussion became a part of the first set of displacements that I made, because I saw him as an example of a displaced human being. So like I said, I'm not really going to talk about too much what we talked about, but I'll mention the fact that, you know, Denny was, in addition to being physically disabled and unable to participate in the activity that was selected by whatever group that he was in that day. You know, he couldn't have climbed the trees in his wheelchair. You know, additionally, you know, he was visually impaired, and he was blind, and so he couldn't really see the activity. He could hear the activity, but in an activity like that, it's difficult to keep track of any individual conversation or to really participate with the activity. You can kind of get the general ambiance of the play, but that's about it. And he had really specific questions, not about, you know, in addition to you know, what was going on, questions about what was going on in the activity of the games and the play, questions about the broader world. Particularly the fires in the mountains, but other things too. You know, I could answer those questions. And I could describe for him the play and what was going on. And I could become his eyes. And I could become his window, whether broken or unbroken, onto the world. And I often think of Denny sitting outside of the course I often think of Denny sitting outside the course of the activity. And the pain that it causes me to remember him. Is almost unbearable. And it has almost nothing to do with Denny's actual physical embodiment in the world, but everything to do with his abandonment and neglect and the failure of both the children and the adults in his environment to find a way to include him in the participation of the games and the play. And the pain is so unbearable that to hold the memory for any considerable amount of time is really, for me, an exercise of, will and mental discipline. And to speak of the memory is also an exercise in mental discipline, because I can't come to the memory completely and directly and still retain the ability to speak. I have to approach it and feel for its edge. I can only get so close to the memory. Before I lose my ability to communicate entirely. You know, I am able to shed tears, but it's not the display of tears that I really want to provide to an audience in discussing Denny. It's his story, and how many, you know, people were there, and how many people, it's not only with Denny was it a matter of individuals not, you know, choosing to participate with him, to communicate with him. I really honestly believe now that, you know, they didn't see him, or they didn't, you know, see his suffering. They couldn't put themselves there. They couldn't see that whatever they were doing, whatever plans they had, whatever they had to do at 2 o'clock, whatever the next appointment was, whatever behavior problems their own child was having, none of it was important. They couldn't put it in a hierarchy of needs and recognize that the most important thing that needed to be done in that particular moment was just drop everything and communicate with Denny. They couldn't see it. It wasn't, they didn't think of this as, they may have thought of him as sad. You know, have you ever been in a situation with someone where a beggar, you know, comes up to you, and, you know, either a homeless person or someone begging for some other reason, and this beggar asks for money, and the person that you're with, they give them money, and they give them money to say, yes, go away, I can't bear your presence, and also, aren't I a good person for giving you money? And it's so extraordinarily meaningless and empty, and beside the point. And of course the beggar knows this, right? The beggar knows that his or her presence is unbearable to the charitable one, that wants to believe that he or she is a good person, and so will pay this bribe or this pay this, it's almost a form of blackmail, right? In order to go on believing that you're a good person, you're going to have to give me this money. But it's not the same, is it? It's not the same as, you know, seeing the need of the thou before your eyes and providing them with what you can to recognize their need and to create a bridge between you of understanding that in some ways, not only recognizes their needs, but provides for their needs. And, I often, think of Denny, and I often, approach this memory and this pain and this unbearable pain. And this pain, I have thought of in different ways. In relationship to my work. And one of the ways that I have thought of my work is I know that human beings run from pain and don't want to experience pain, don't want to see Denny, and yet, I've made it I have made seeing Denny as your responsibility as my life's work. And so I understand that seeing Denny as your responsibility is impossible for most of you. And therefore, I understand that seeing my life's work is impossible for most of you. And one could, try to buffer the difficulties of that problem and say, something like, oh, but that's okay because, but it's not okay, or I wouldn't continue. It's not okay. And the not being okay isn't okay either. There's no point that, that I'll step back and say, whatever. Or it's just water. It just is. I don't know where this idea came from, but in some poetic discussions of the materiality of textuality, you get this line that's like, it's just an image, or it's just water, or it's not situated in this context or that context, and this is a totally anti-ecological way of thinking about things, and whenever you get to that point where you say it's not this, and it's not this in relationship to the syntax, and it's not this in relationship to the context, and No, it doesn't really. It just is. No, it never just is. It always is. It always is our world. It always belongs to us. It always is our life. Denny just isn't Denny. Denny is your child. Denny is situated in a context in which he's excluded. Denny is not at play. Denny is not at rest. Denny is not at peace. Denny is hungry. Denny is sad. Denny belongs to us. Denny is your responsibility, you know, and no amount of charity or giving 25 cents or, he's not asking for that anyway, was he? He wasn't, no. You know, maybe later he'll learn, unfortunately, you know, maybe some people learn to manipulate other people's guilt and lack of care, and, you know, he would have been able to become a beggar and ask you for the 25 cents. But if he does, please don't give it to him. Please have a discussion with him and remind him of the fact that he belongs to you. You know, and this is how some pieces find a name. You know, Denny found a name, and this piece is wanting to find a name and seeing Denny as your responsibility, or the impossibility of seeing Denny as your responsibility. And it wasn't that Denny was broken, and it still isn't that Denny was broken. It's that we're broken. And I didn't cry because Denny was blind, and I didn't cry because Denny was in a wheelchair, and I didn't cry because Denny had unusual cognitive processing abilities and limitations, and had a different way of seeing the world. I cried because it was so difficult for so many of us to see what we were doing to Denny. Displacements for Thursday, October 14th, 2021. Displacement 3. Reasons for breaking glass. There are a lot of reasons for breaking glass, and I've broken a lot of glass over my time here on Earth. And sometimes those reasons fall into patterns. I may have gone through periods of breaking glass this way or breaking glass that way, of justifying the breaking of glass for these reasons or for those reasons. And sometimes the breaking of glass hadn't been a literal breaking of glass. Sometimes the glass might represent an individual, and the pane of glass, the surface of glass, might have represented a relationship or a way of thinking about the word glass, or a way of thinking about the world glass, and seeing and breaking ways of seeing that were socially constructed to exclude. In this case, the window glass that's broken is barred, and the exclusion is clearly visual. But in most acts of breaking glass, where there are no bars, the exclusion may or may not be visible. Publication can be a form of glass if one thinks of the display of one's work as a viewing. Publication, the presentation to the public, a display of one's work in perhaps visual form. Visual form that the public is capable of transforming back into acoustic and verbal form through reading, but that's presented in visual form. So a kind of viewing, a kind of window, a kind of glass that includes perhaps those who can afford to pay for the work and excludes those who can't, in addition to excluding those who aren't presented in the frame of the image of the glass that, or who lie outside the frame of the glass. And there are, of course, a number of ways of breaking glass. One can break this type of glass with a stone or a pebble thrown at the glass. One can strike the glass with a stick or a mallet or a hammer and break the glass. Or one can put one's hand through the glass. In instances of those who put their hands through the glass and suffer injury, in addition to breaking the glass, there are typically repercussions that involve assessments of self-harm to assessments of the destruction of property. Breaking glass always already raises the question of property. Whose glass was it that you broke? Was it your own glass or someone else's glass? And if it was someone else's glass, breaking glass always already raises the questions and problems of capitalism and the authorities who enforce the laws and rules against not only breaking glass, but against the destruction and theft of all forms of property that exist under capitalism. Never mind that most of the ownership rights of those forms and objects which exist under capitalism authorized as property or described by the construct of property were always already stolen to begin with. For example, since none of the territory in the United States belonged to Europeans prior to the great period of colonialization, if one refers to it in any way as great, and the continuation of colonialism via Western expansion as celebrated by poets as diverse as Walt Whitman and And whoever it was, the poet and architect who first formulated the idea for that monument to Western expansion in St. Louis, that is simply and singularly a gigantic steel arch. So property has a different history than the laws regulating the breaking of glass would have us believe. There is a transparency to the glass that the laws pretend to have in relationship to the construct of property. There is, however, a film on the glass that if we look carefully and examine closely, we can see obstructs the transparency of the image, just as we can see that the transparency of ownership of the glass is obstructed by the history of the ownership of property and what makes property owned to begin with. Isn't property simply the possession of a good acquired by some means authorized by an original theft? I think of Israel and his struggle with the angel to receive the angel's blessings. And Yaakov had always already stolen such blessings. Wasn't the initial blessing from his father also an act of theft? One could say he bargained with his brother, his hungry brother, over a bowl of porridge. It was in some philosophical senses, fair trade. But in what way was it not a theft? And in what way was the struggle with the angel not an act of theft? And if it was a theft, did the blessing truly belong to him? Or was it a delusion of transparency in the way that focusing on those parts of the window that it is still possible to see out of gives us a delusion of this window's transparency. And there are also functions in the breaking of glass that belong to the act of breaking glass that vary across time, across lifetimes, across generations of time. across the time of windows, across the time of eyes, across the time of day, across the time of night, across the time of earth. And depending on the length of time, the window can be seen as either literal or metaphorical or even meta-metaphorical if there are no minds possessed with eyes with which to see. There's a window that was broken in my wife Lori's class recently by a child who's a breaker of windows. And this window that was broken in my wife Lori's class by this child was a fire. And this fire was set in a trash can. And that trash can and that fire was the breaking of a window. And the reason that it was the breaking of a window was because the child was very unhappy at school in the window of education. And I'm not entirely sure why the child was unhappy at school in the window of education, but I suspect a number of things. The window of education as it's presented to us today is a window of testing, evaluation, standardization, inculcation, exclusion, justification, discipline, standardization, and I suspect that some of those aspects of the window of education pertain to the way that this particular child was unhappy in this window of space and time that belonged to a 10-hour period of his living experience 5 days a week. And I suspect that the breaking of the glass, I had suspected that the breaking of the glass, which was a fire set in a trash can in this instance of the breaking of glass, was a window onto this unhappiness. And I had suspected that the reason for the breaking of the glass, which in this instance was the setting of a fire in the trash can, had a functional design. And the breaking of the glass's functional design was to remove the child from the place of unhappiness, which was the window of education. Because the consequences for breaking a glass in this manner, in the form of setting a fire in a classroom, within the window of education, in this particular instance, in which discipline was not so much a window, but a door leading elsewhere. And the door leading elsewhere was called expulsion. And one could open the door of expulsion through this window of breaking glass that was the setting of a fire in a classroom. And I suspected that the consequences of the actions, which were intended as a discipline, were precisely the functional value that the breaker of glass intended in order to open the door on the window of education that, for the child who was a breaker of glass, was a place of unhappiness. And so it turned out to be, because even when the period of expulsion had elapsed and the discipline of the property owner of the broken glass, who was the rule maker for this particular kind of breaking glass, that was of setting fire in a trash can in the school, for when the period of that expulsion had elapsed and the child returned to the window of education, the child asked to be written up again as a breaker of glass, because the only way that the child could escape the barred window of education was to be disciplined for breaking the glass.